As you drift into sleep tonight, witness the final moments of Marguerite de Rouen, age 19, whose head rolled across the blood-soaked stones of a London courtyard on March 15, 1321. The executioner's axe fell with the precision of medieval justice, ending a life for a crime so trivial that the crowd stood in stunned silence. Her offense? She had dared to say no to her husband when he asked her to serve his dinner cold. 3 judges, 2 priests, and 47 witnesses agreed. Death was the only appropriate punishment for a woman who spoke without permission. Tonight, you'll discover the documented executions of dozens of women whose final words were silenced forever. Not for murder, not for theft, not for treason, but for the unforgivable act of using their voice when they should have stayed quiet. This is medieval justice at its most brutal and most petty, and every single case I'm about to share with you actually happened. The morning mist still clung to the cobblestones of London's execution courtyard when Marguerite de Rouen took her final steps. But her story didn't begin with defiance. It started with something far more ordinary and infinitely more terrifying. A simple domestic disagreement that spiraled into a death sentence thanks to medieval Europe's most bizarre legal system. You see, Marguerite wasn't a witch, a thief, or a political rebel. She was a baker's wife whose greatest crime was possessing what medieval authorities called an ungoverned tongue, a condition so dangerous that it required the ultimate cure. The year 1321 marked the height of what historians now call the Domestic Inquisition, a period when church and state authorities decided that maintaining social order required monitoring, documenting, and brutally punishing women who dared to speak out of turn within their own homes. Marguerite's husband, Pierre, had initially seemed like a reasonable man when he married her 3 years earlier, but medieval marriage contracts included clauses that modern people would find absolutely insane. Literal legal obligations for wives to maintain perpetual silence unless directly addressed, immediate compliance with all reasonable and unreasonable requests, and most bizarrely, acoustic submission, which meant speaking only in whispers when discussing household matters. The church had spent decades developing these matrimonial codes not out of pure misogyny, though that was certainly part of it, but because they genuinely believed that uncontrolled female speech could corrupt the spiritual fabric of Christian society, spreading what they called domestic heresy from house to house like a plague of words. Brother Marcus, the inquisitor who eventually signed Marguerite's death warrant, had written extensively about the feminine tongue as Satan's preferred instrument, arguing that women's natural inclination toward conversation represented a fundamental threat to divine order, a theory that somehow convinced 3 different courts, 47 witnesses, and ultimately the executioner himself. What makes Marguerite's case particularly haunting is how perfectly ordinary the triggering incident was. Pierre had returned from a long day at the market, exhausted and hungry, expecting his dinner to be waiting hot on the table, but Marguerite had let it grow cold while she finished mending his torn work shirt, a thoughtful gesture that would prove fatally misguided. When Pierre demanded to know why his meal wasn't ready, Marguerite made the catastrophic mistake of explaining that she had prioritized his clothing repair, then compounded her error by suggesting he could reheat the food himself while she finished her work. Pierre's response wasn't immediate violence. Medieval men had been trained to follow proper legal channels when dealing with wifely insubordination. So he carefully documented Marguerite's words, noted the time of day, gathered witness testimony from neighbors who had overheard the exchange, and filed formal charges with Brother Marcus's ecclesiastical court within 24 hours. The speed of medieval legal machinery when it came to female speech crimes was absolutely remarkable. What took months or years for murder cases could be resolved in days when a woman's tongue was deemed guilty of matrimonial treason. To understand how Marguerite's dinner dispute became a capital offense, we need to step back and examine the absolutely insane legal framework that medieval Europe had constructed around marriage, speech, and female behavior during the early 14th century. A system so comprehensive and so ruthlessly enforced that it makes modern surveillance states look like amateur operations. The foundation of this madness began in 1215 when the Fourth Lateran Council declared that marriage was not just a personal contract between 2 people but a sacred institution requiring constant governmental oversight, which sounds reasonable until you realize they interpreted oversight to mean monitoring every conversation, gesture, and facial expression that occurred between husband and wife within the privacy of their own homes. By 1300, the Church had established what they called matrimonial surveillance networks throughout England and France, essentially spy rings consisting of neighbors, servants, relatives, and even children who were legally obligated to report any signs of domestic discord to local ecclesiastical authorities, creating a society where marital arguments became matters of national security. The punishment system they developed was breathtakingly elaborate. First-time offenders faced public penance, which involved standing in the town square wearing signs detailing their crimes while citizens threw rotten vegetables and jeered. Second offenses resulted in fines that could bankrupt entire families, plus mandatory domestic education sessions where priests would spend hours lecturing couples about proper matrimonial behavior. Third violations triggered what they called marital incarceration, where both spouses would be imprisoned separately for weeks or months to contemplate their failures in Christian submission. But the system's true genius, if you can call systematic oppression genius, lay in how it transformed ordinary domestic life into a constant performance of religious devotion, where every interaction between husband and wife had to conform to incredibly specific behavioral codes that the church had spent centuries developing and refining. Women were required to maintain what ecclesiastical law termed appropriate vocal modulation at all times, meaning they couldn't speak louder than a whisper, couldn't interrupt their husbands under any circumstances, couldn't offer opinions unless specifically requested, and couldn't discuss household decisions with anyone outside the immediate family. Violations of any of these rules could trigger immediate legal proceedings. The church justified this system by claiming that uncontrolled female speech was literally a form of heresy, arguing that when women spoke freely, they were channeling demonic influences that could corrupt not just their own souls but the spiritual purity of their entire community. A theory that somehow convinced thousands of medieval people to participate in this elaborate machinery of domestic oppression. What made the system particularly effective was its economic incentives. Neighbors who reported violations received portions of the resulting fines, priests who processed cases earned substantial fees, and local authorities could confiscate property from families unable to pay penalties, creating a profitable industry built around policing marital conversations. The legal precedents were meticulously documented in massive volumes that traveled from court to court, ensuring that a woman's punishment in London would be identical to what she'd face in Paris or Rome, making this perhaps history's first international standardized system for criminalizing female expression. By 1320, when Marguerite found herself facing the executioner's block, this legal framework had become so entrenched, so normalized, and so profitable that questioning its fundamental premises was itself considered a form of heresy, which explains why even supposedly sympathetic observers stood by and watched as women died for the crime of having voices. The truly bizarre aspect of medieval marriage law wasn't just its harshness, but the absolutely absurd, meticulously detailed, almost comically specific rules that governed every moment of a woman's daily existence. Rules so intricate and so numerous that compliance required constant, exhausting, soul-crushing vigilance that would drive modern people to complete nervous breakdowns within hours. The church had published what they called the Codex Matrimonialis, a massive, leather-bound tome containing over 300 pages of regulations covering everything from acceptable breakfast conversation topics, to proper posture while serving meals, to approved facial expressions during intimate moments, to the exact number of steps a wife could take without her husband's explicit permission. And yes, they actually counted steps, because medieval authorities had apparently decided that female mobility was inherently suspicious and required mathematical precision. Women were forbidden from laughing too loudly, which the church defined as any sound audible from more than 10 feet away. They couldn't hum while working, because humming was considered a form of unauthorized musical performance that might distract men from their devotional thoughts. They couldn't ask questions about their husband's work, finances, or social relationships, because curiosity about male affairs was classified as a form of domestic espionage that threatened patriarchal authority. The rules governing physical movement were particularly insane. Wives had to walk exactly 3 steps behind their husbands in public, they couldn't run under any circumstances unless fleeing immediate physical danger, they were prohibited from climbing stairs ahead of their spouses, and they had to request permission before opening doors, sitting down, or even adjusting their clothing if their husband was present. Imagine living your entire life as if you were a child asking permission to use the bathroom, except the consequences for rule violations included public humiliation, financial ruin, physical punishment, and potentially death. Perhaps most bizarrely, the church had developed elaborate protocols for managing female emotional expressions, categorizing different types of tears, smiles, frowns, and sighs according to their spiritual significance and appropriate usage. Tears of joy were permitted during religious ceremonies but forbidden during secular celebrations. Smiling was acceptable when greeting church officials but prohibited when interacting with male neighbors. Sighing was allowed when expressing devotion to God, but criminalized when indicating frustration with domestic duties. The enforcement mechanisms were equally absurd, with medieval communities employing official, domestic observers, usually older women who had successfully navigated decades of matrimonial surveillance and now earned small payments by monitoring younger wives for violations, essentially creating a system where women policed other women's compliance with rules designed to keep all women perpetually subjugated, terrified, and silent. These observers carried small notebooks where they recorded infractions with scientific precision. Subject spoke above whisper level at 2:30 in the afternoon while requesting bread from baker, or subject displayed unauthorized smile while greeting neighbor's child at morning market, or subject walked 4 steps behind husband instead of required 3 steps, creating dangerous gap in matrimonial formation. The church had even developed seasonal regulations, because apparently women's voices were considered more dangerous during certain months. Speaking restrictions were tighter during Lent, when female chatter might distract from spiritual contemplation, looser during harvest season when practical communication was necessary for survival, and absolutely draconian during Christmas and Easter when women's natural tendency toward celebration might corrupt religious observances. What makes this entire system even more surreal is that medieval authorities genuinely believed they were protecting women from their own inherently sinful natures, arguing that strict behavioral controls were acts of Christian mercy that saved female souls from eternal damnation. A twisted logic that convinced thousands of people to participate in this elaborate, profitable, utterly demented machinery of oppression that turned marriage into a prison sentence and conversation into a capital crime. Now, let's dive into the actual case that started this entire legal nightmare, the documented incident that would establish precedent for hundreds of similar executions across medieval Europe, because what happened to Lady Eleanor de Cambridge in 1318 was so shocking, so perfectly documented, and so utterly trivial in its origins that it reads like dark satire written by someone who despised both marriage and medieval justice. Sir William de Cambridge, Eleanor's husband of 6 years, was what medieval society considered an exemplary gentleman. He attended church regularly, paid his taxes promptly, treated his servants with reasonable kindness, and had never been accused of any serious crimes, which made his decision to pursue capital charges against his wife all the more chilling, because it demonstrated how completely normal, apparently decent people could become instruments of systematic oppression when given the legal tools to do so. The triggering incident occurred on a Tuesday morning in September, when Sir William returned from a 3-day hunting expedition expecting to find his household running with military precision, his meals prepared according to his exact specifications, his clothing cleaned and mended, and his wife waiting in appropriate domestic submission to welcome him home with the quiet gratitude that medieval marriage manuals demanded from properly trained wives. Instead, he discovered that Eleanor had made a series of decisions during his absence that would ultimately cost her life. She had rearranged the furniture in their main hall to better accommodate sunlight for her embroidery work. She had invited her sister to stay overnight without seeking his prior permission. She had purchased expensive spices from a traveling merchant using household funds. And most fatally, she had given their kitchen servants permission to visit family in a neighboring village, leaving the house temporarily understaffed when Sir William arrived home hungry and expecting immediate service. When Sir William demanded explanations for these unauthorized decisions, Eleanor made what medieval law would classify as a catastrophic error in judgment. Instead of immediately apologizing and begging forgiveness, she calmly explained her reasoning for each choice, defending her actions as sensible household management that had improved their domestic situation during his absence, a response that Sir William interpreted as defiant argumentation rather than respectful explanation. The conversation escalated when Eleanor pointed out that her furniture rearrangement had actually saved money by reducing their need for expensive candles during daylight hours, that her sister's visit had provided valuable assistance with seasonal food preservation, that the exotic spices would enhance their winter meals and impress future dinner guests, and that allowing servants to maintain family relationships ultimately improved their loyalty and work quality, logical arguments that any modern person would consider perfectly reasonable but that medieval marriage law classified as domestic insubordination with intellectual pretensions, a particularly serious offense that implied a wife believed herself capable of complex decision-making without masculine guidance. Sir William documented every word of Eleanor's defense, carefully noting her tone of voice, her facial expressions, her posture during the conversation, and the specific phrases she used to justify her actions, because medieval legal proceedings required extensive evidence gathering to ensure that accusations of matrimonial disobedience could withstand scrutiny from ecclesiastical courts that took these matters with deadly seriousness. Within 48 hours, Sir William had filed formal charges with Brother Thomas of Canterbury, a church official who specialized in domestic discipline cases and had built his reputation on successfully prosecuting wives who exceeded their prescribed roles, presenting a detailed written complaint that accused Eleanor of willful domestic rebellion, unauthorized financial expenditure, unsupervised social arrangements, and most damningly, intellectual arrogance in the presence of masculine authority, charges that carried penalties ranging from public humiliation to physical punishment to, in cases of repeat offenses or particularly egregious violations, execution by beheading or burning at the stake. The most disturbing aspect of Eleanor's case wasn't the charges themselves, but rather the immediate, enthusiastic, almost gleeful response from her neighbors, friends, and even family members, who transformed overnight from supportive community members into eager participants in a legal lynching that would establish the social dynamics defining medieval marriage prosecutions for decades to come. Within hours of Sir William filing his formal complaint, the entire village of Cambridge had divided into two distinct camps: those who supported Eleanor and risked being labeled as sympathizers to domestic rebellion, and those who condemned her actions as dangerous examples of female overreach that threatened the stability of every marriage in their community. The supporters were few, quiet, and quickly intimidated into silence by social pressure and veiled legal threats, while Eleanor's critics became increasingly vocal, organized, and vindictive as they realized that participating in her prosecution offered them social advancement, financial rewards, and the satisfying opportunity to publicly demonstrate their own commitment to proper Christian values. Margaret the Weaver, Eleanor's former best friend and frequent dinner companion, became one of her most damaging accusers by providing testimony about private conversations where Eleanor had allegedly expressed frustration with household management restrictions, complained about her husband's unreasonable expectations, and worst of all, wondered aloud whether women in other countries enjoyed greater domestic freedoms than English wives were permitted to experience. Thomas the blacksmith, who had previously praised Eleanor's intelligence and practical household skills, suddenly recalled multiple occasions when she had spoken too boldly in public gatherings, interrupted male conversations with unwelcome opinions, and displayed facial expressions that he now interpreted as signs of dangerous pride and spiritual rebellion against divine authority. Even Eleanor's own sister, Mary, who had benefited from the overnight visit that triggered the legal charges, provided testimony suggesting that Eleanor had always been rebellious, difficult to control, and prone to questioning masculine decisions in ways that made family gatherings uncomfortable for everyone involved, though she claimed her testimony was motivated by concerns for Eleanor's spiritual welfare rather than personal animosity or fear of legal consequences. The village priest, Father Benedict, organized what he called community reflection sessions, where neighbors gathered to discuss Eleanor's crimes and their broader implications for social stability, sessions that quickly devolved into gossip festivals where people competed to share the most damning anecdotes about Eleanor's past behavior, creating a public atmosphere so toxic and hysterical that even neutral observers began questioning whether Eleanor might actually deserve severe punishment for crimes they had previously considered minor domestic disagreements. The church encouraged this community participation by offering spiritual rewards for citizens who provided useful testimony in matrimonial discipline cases, promising reduced penance requirements, preferential treatment in confession, and enhanced social status within religious organizations for people who demonstrated proper concern for maintaining Christian marriage standards through active involvement in legal proceedings against rebellious wives. Local merchants, recognizing profitable opportunities, began selling special, domestic discipline pamphlets containing advice about identifying signs of female rebellion in other households, prayers for wives struggling with submissive attitudes, and detailed explanations of proper procedures for reporting matrimonial violations to church authorities, essentially turning Eleanor's prosecution into a commercial enterprise that generated revenue while spreading paranoia about female behavior. Throughout medieval society, women in the community faced an impossible choice. They could support Eleanor and risk being labeled as potential rebels themselves, facing increased scrutiny from their own husbands and neighbors, or they could join the prosecution and demonstrate their commitment to proper feminine behavior while contributing to the destruction of someone who had once been their friend and ally. Most chose self-preservation over solidarity, providing testimony, sharing gossip, and participating in community condemnation with an enthusiasm that revealed how thoroughly the system had trained women to police each other's compliance with oppressive behavioral standards that ultimately harmed everyone involved. The psychological pressure on Eleanor during this period must have been absolutely crushing, as she watched her entire social world transform into a hostile environment where former friends became enemies, trusted confidants became accusers, and every relationship she had built over years of community involvement collapsed into suspicion, betrayal, and eager participation in her systematic destruction. By the time formal legal proceedings began, Eleanor had been socially convicted by a community that had convinced itself that her punishment was necessary for protecting their own marriages, families, and spiritual welfare from the dangerous influence of a woman who had dared to make household decisions without appropriate masculine guidance. Brother Thomas of Canterbury wasn't content with simply processing Eleanor's case through standard ecclesiastical channels, because he recognized that her prosecution represented a golden opportunity to establish himself as the Church's leading authority on domestic discipline while creating a legal framework that would generate substantial revenue, enhance clerical power, and provide a systematic method for controlling female behavior throughout medieval England. Thomas had spent years studying canon law, developing theories about feminine psychology, and building relationships with influential church officials who shared his belief that uncontrolled wives represented the greatest threat to Christian civilization since the original temptation in the Garden of Eden, making him uniquely qualified to transform Eleanor's relatively minor domestic dispute into a landmark legal case that would reshape marriage law for generations. Within a week of receiving Sir William's complaint, Brother Thomas had convinced his ecclesiastical superiors to authorize the creation of what he called the Tribunal of Domestic Virtues, a specialized court system designed exclusively for processing cases involving female matrimonial misconduct, with himself as chief judge and a hand-picked team of assistant clerics who shared his enthusiasm for aggressive enforcement of submission requirements that most people considered reasonable guidelines rather than legally enforceable mandates. The tribunal's first official act was commissioning a comprehensive investigation of Eleanor's entire married life, assigning teams of monks to interview every person who had ever interacted with her, examine her personal belongings for evidence of rebellious attitudes, analyze her correspondence for signs of inappropriate thoughts, and compile a detailed psychological profile that would demonstrate the progression of her descent from proper Christian wife to dangerous domestic rebel who threatened social stability. Brother Marcus, Thomas's most trusted assistant, specialized in what they called retrospective sin analysis, a technique that involved reinterpreting past events through the lens of current accusations, allowing prosecutors to transform previously innocent actions into evidence of long-term criminal patterns that justified severe punishment for crimes that defendants might not even realize they had committed over years of apparently normal married life. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Eleanor's individual case as Brother Thomas realized that establishing effective precedents required demonstrating that domestic rebellion was a widespread problem affecting multiple households throughout their jurisdiction, leading to fishing expeditions targeting other wives whose husbands could be convinced to file similar complaints in exchange for reduced church taxes, enhanced social status, and guaranteed support from ecclesiastical authorities. In future domestic disputes, Father Benedict eagerly provided lists of women in his parish who had displayed questionable attitudes toward masculine authority, including Sarah the miller's wife who had been observed reading books without her husband's supervision, and the carpenter's wife who had expressed opinions about local politics during market conversations, and Joan the merchant's wife who had been seen walking alone after sunset without proper masculine escort, violations that Brother Thomas classified as preliminary indicators of domestic insurrection, requiring immediate investigation and potential prosecution. The church hierarchy was initially skeptical about Thomas's ambitious plans, but their resistance quickly evaporated when he demonstrated the financial potential of systematic domestic discipline enforcement, presenting calculations showing that matrimonial fines could generate more revenue than traditional tithes, property taxes, and even the sale of religious indulgences, making domestic rebellion prosecutions one of the most profitable legal enterprises in medieval ecclesiastical history. Pope John XXII, always interested in new revenue streams to fund his expensive building projects and political campaigns, issued an official papal bull endorsing the Tribunal of Domestic Virtues and authorizing similar courts throughout Europe, declaring that proper Christian marriage required constant surveillance, aggressive enforcement, and severe punishment for wives who exceeded their prescribed roles within the divine hierarchy that God had established for human relationships. Local secular authorities, initially concerned about ecclesiastical courts expanding their jurisdiction into domestic matters that had traditionally been handled through informal community mediation, quickly became enthusiastic supporters when they realized that the Church's domestic discipline system actually strengthened their own power by creating legal precedents for controlling civilian behavior, generating shared revenue through joint prosecutions, and establishing cooperative relationships that enhanced overall governmental authority throughout medieval society. The speed with which this institutional machinery assembled around Eleanor's case was absolutely remarkable, transforming a simple marital disagreement into the foundation for an entire legal industry dedicated to criminalizing female autonomy, with Eleanor serving as the unfortunate test case whose prosecution would establish procedures, precedents, and profit margins for thousands of similar cases that would terrorize medieval wives for the next 2 centuries. The Tribunal of Domestic Virtue's greatest achievement, and perhaps medieval history's most comprehensive catalogue of female criminality, was the publication of their legendary Catalogus Criminalium Domesticorum, a 47-page legal document that systematically classified every conceivable way a medieval wife could violate her matrimonial obligations, creating a bureaucratic nightmare so detailed, so ridiculously specific, and so utterly insane that it makes modern tax codes look like simple children's picture books by comparison. Brother Thomas and his team of legal scholars spent months interviewing hundreds of husbands, analyzing thousands of domestic complaints, and consulting with European experts on feminine psychology to produce what they considered the definitive guide to identifying, documenting, and prosecuting female domestic rebellion in all its subtle and obvious manifestations throughout Christian society. The catalog divided female crimes into 7 major categories: vocal violations, physical transgressions, emotional misconduct, intellectual overreach, social improprieties, economic insubordination, and spiritual defiance, with each category containing dozens of specific infractions that carried precisely calculated penalties ranging from minor penances to capital punishment, depending on the severity, frequency, and social impact of the particular violation in question. Vocal violations included such serious crimes as speaking above prescribed whisper levels during morning hours, humming secular melodies while performing sacred domestic duties, asking more than 3 questions per day about household matters, using words longer than 2 syllables without specific permission, laughing in a manner audible beyond the immediate room, sighing with apparent frustration during domestic tasks, and most bizarrely, verbal breathing patterns that suggest mental disagreement with masculine instructions, a crime that apparently required special training to detect and prosecute effectively. Physical transgressions were equally comprehensive, covering walking faster than husband's natural pace, opening doors with excessive force that might startle masculine sensibilities, sitting down before husband has selected his preferred seating arrangement, touching household objects without clear domestic necessity, displaying facial expressions that contradict appropriate feminine submission, hand gestures that might be interpreted as dismissive or argumentative, and the particularly serious offense of occupying physical space in a manner that draws attention away from masculine presence, which could apparently be committed simply by standing in well-lit areas during social gatherings. The emotional misconduct section revealed medieval authorities' fascinating beliefs about proper feminine psychology, criminalizing displaying happiness during periods designated for solemn reflection, expressing curiosity about subjects beyond domestic management, showing interest in activities that do not directly benefit masculine comfort, emotional responses that exceed prescribed intensity levels for specific situations, facial expressions suggesting independent thought processes, signs of boredom during religious instruction about feminine duties, and most remarkably, internal emotional states that create spiritual disturbances in the household atmosphere, a crime that apparently could be detected through careful observation of a woman's general demeanor and energy levels. Intellectual overreach targeted women's mental activities with surgical precision, prohibiting reading materials not specifically approved by masculine authority, mathematical calculations beyond basic household accounting, expressing opinions about subjects requiring advanced education, demonstrating knowledge that exceeds husband's expertise in any area, asking questions that reveal familiarity with concepts beyond domestic management, making logical connections between different ideas without guidance, and the absolutely incredible crime of thinking thoughts that are inappropriate for feminine minds, which required special ecclesiastical techniques to investigate and prove in legal proceedings. Social improprieties governed women's interactions with their communities, forbidding conversations with other women about domestic dissatisfaction, friendships that provide emotional support independent of matrimonial relationships, social activities that do not include appropriate masculine supervision, displaying personality traits that make other wives dissatisfied with their own situations, participating in community events with excessive enthusiasm or visible enjoyment, forming opinions about neighbors' domestic arrangements, and most insidiously, creating social situations where feminine perspectives receive more attention than masculine wisdom, essentially criminalizing any form of female social leadership or influence. Economic insubordination and spiritual defiance completed this comprehensive framework for controlling every aspect of feminine existence, with penalties that escalated from public embarrassment and financial ruin to physical punishment and ultimately execution, creating a legal system so thorough and so terrifying that simply being born female in medieval Europe meant living under constant threat of prosecution for crimes that modern people would consider basic human activities, fundamental rights, or completely imaginary offenses that existed only in the twisted imaginations of men who had convinced themselves that female autonomy represented an existential threat to Christian civilization itself. The publication of the Catalogus Criminalium Domesticorum created consequences that even Brother Thomas hadn't anticipated, because within months of its official release, medieval society descended into a paranoid nightmare where husbands became obsessed with documenting their wives' every movement, neighbors transformed into professional domestic spies, and women developed elaborate survival strategies that were simultaneously hilarious, heartbreaking, and absolutely terrifying in their desperate creativity. The immediate effect was economic chaos, as thousands of men abandoned their regular work to spend entire days following their wives around with notebooks, carefully recording potential violations, measuring whisper volumes with primitive acoustic devices, and timing household tasks to ensure compliance with newly established efficiency standards that treated domestic management like military operations requiring constant supervision and documentation. Village markets ground to a halt because male merchants were too busy monitoring their wives' shopping behaviors to conduct normal business. Farmers neglected their crops while obsessing over their wives' gardening techniques, and craftsmen produced shoddy goods because they were distracted by fears that their wives might be committing undetected crimes in adjacent rooms, creating an economic recession that medieval authorities initially blamed on feminine domestic rebellion rather than their own insane legal system. Women responded to this surveillance with ingenious countermeasures that revealed remarkable intelligence, resilience, and dark humor. They developed elaborate hand signal systems for communicating with other women without speaking, created coded household arrangement patterns that conveyed complex messages through furniture placement, and established underground networks for sharing survival strategies that included techniques for silent crying, invisible rebellion, and maintaining sanity, while living under constant observation by increasingly paranoid husbands. The most successful adaptation was what historians now call malicious compliance, where women followed the Catalogus requirements with such obsessive precision that they effectively paralyzed their households. Wives would stand motionless for hours waiting for specific permission to perform each individual task, speak in whispers so quiet that husbands couldn't understand basic communication, and interpret instructions with such literal accuracy that simple requests became impossibly complicated procedures requiring extensive clarification and documentation. Sarah the miller's wife became legendary for her response to accusations of walking faster than husband's natural pace, by thereafter moving so slowly that completing basic household tasks required entire days, forcing her husband to either abandon his complaints or watch his domestic routine collapse into complete dysfunction, a strategy that other women quickly copied with devastating effectiveness throughout medieval communities. The Church found itself overwhelmed with domestic violation reports, as the Catalogus had made virtually every aspect of female existence potentially criminal, resulting in thousands of simultaneous cases that exceeded the processing capacity of ecclesiastical courts, created massive bureaucratic backlogs, and required hiring additional staff at enormous expense that quickly exceeded the revenue generated by matrimonial fines and penalties. Brother Thomas discovered that systematic domestic surveillance was logistically impossible to maintain, because monitoring compliance with 47 different categories of feminine crime required constant attention from trained observers, specialized equipment for measuring vocal volumes and physical movements, and extensive paperwork that absorbed more time and resources than the violations themselves were worth, essentially proving that totalitarian control over domestic life was economically unsustainable even in medieval society. The psychological consequences were equally dramatic, as men who had initially embraced the opportunity to exercise absolute authority over their wives began experiencing anxiety, paranoia, and exhaustion from the constant vigilance required to detect potential violations, with many reporting that their marriages had become joyless, tense, and utterly exhausting experiences that provided none of the domestic comfort and companionship that had supposedly motivated their participation in the domestic discipline system. Villages that had enthusiastically supported domestic surveillance programs found themselves divided into hostile camps of accusers and defenders, with social relationships deteriorating into networks of suspicion, blackmail, and revenge prosecutions that made normal community life impossible, as every interaction carried the potential for legal consequences that could destroy families, bankrupt households, and result in imprisonment or execution for crimes that had previously been considered minor social friction. Perhaps most ironically, the systematic criminalization of female behavior actually undermined traditional masculine authority by revealing how completely dependent medieval men were on their wives' voluntary cooperation, intelligence, and emotional labor, because when women withdrew these contributions in response to legal threats, households collapsed into chaos that demonstrated the absurdity of treating competent domestic partners as dangerous criminals requiring constant supervision and punishment. The catalogus had promised to create perfectly obedient wives, but instead produced a society of terrified, resentful, strategically non-compliant women whose creative resistance strategies were far more disruptive to social order than the original crimes that the legal system had been designed to prevent, proving that oppression often creates exactly the problems it claims to solve while generating entirely new forms of conflict that are much more difficult to control or resolve through traditional authority structures. Just when medieval society thought the domestic discipline system couldn't possibly become more absurd, along came the case of Agnes the baker, whose prosecution in 1322 established new legal precedents that made Eleanor's execution look almost reasonable by comparison, because Agnes was charged, tried, convicted, and ultimately burned at the stake for the unforgivable crime of demonstrating excessive physical competence while performing domestic duties, a violation so bizarre that it required creating entirely new categories of feminine misconduct that had never existed in previous legal frameworks. Agnes had committed the fatal error of being exceptionally good at her job, operating the most successful bakery in Norwich, producing bread that was consistently superior to her competitors' products, managing her business finances with remarkable skill, and maintaining customer relationships that generated steady profits during economically difficult times, achievements that her husband, Robert, initially celebrated as beneficial to their household prosperity until Brother Thomas convinced him that feminine competence was actually a form of spiritual rebellion against divine gender hierarchies. The investigation began when Robert filed a complaint alleging that Agnes's baking success made other husbands in their community feel inadequate, because their wives couldn't produce bread of comparable quality, creating what ecclesiastical authorities classified as domestic disruption through superior feminine performance. A crime that apparently threatened social stability by establishing unrealistic expectations for other women's domestic capabilities throughout medieval society. Brother Thomas, eager to expand his legal theories into new areas of feminine misconduct, dispatched investigators to Agnes's bakery, where they discovered evidence of what they called systematized domestic efficiency, including detailed record-keeping systems, innovative baking techniques, advanced customer service protocols, and financial management strategies that demonstrated intellectual capabilities that medieval authorities considered inappropriate for feminine minds to possess or exercise. The charges against Agnes revealed the tribunal's growing sophistication in identifying increasingly subtle forms of female rebellion. She was accused of creating bread products that exceeded appropriate feminine quality standards, demonstrating mathematical abilities beyond prescribed domestic necessity, maintaining business relationships that provided excessive personal satisfaction, displaying pride in professional accomplishments that overshadowed masculine achievements, generating income levels that threatened traditional economic gender roles, and most damningly, inspiring other women to develop unrealistic ambitions regarding their own domestic capabilities and personal potential. The trial proceedings were particularly surreal, featuring expert testimony from male bakers who claimed that Agnes's superior bread quality could only be explained by supernatural assistance, theological arguments about whether feminine business success represented a form of witchcraft or heresy, and detailed examinations of Agnes's baking techniques to determine whether her methods violated natural laws governing appropriate feminine behavior in commercial environments. Brother Marcus, serving as chief prosecutor, argued that Agnes had essentially committed fraud by presenting herself as a simple baker while actually operating as what he called a domestic insurgent, whose apparent innocence masked a sophisticated campaign to undermine masculine economic authority through demonstrations of superior feminine competence that threatened social order by proving that women could succeed in traditionally masculine roles. The defense, such as it was, consisted primarily of Agnes's husband Robert explaining that he had initially supported her baking business because it generated useful income, but had gradually realized that her success was causing him social embarrassment, professional jealousy, and spiritual anxiety about his role as household leader, making him a victim of her manipulative use of domestic skills for inappropriate personal advancement and community influence. Agnes herself was permitted to speak only briefly during the proceedings, and when she attempted to explain that her baking techniques were simply the result of years of practice, attention to detail, and genuine interest in producing quality products, Brother Thomas interrupted to note that her eloquent self-defense was itself evidence of the intellectual arrogance that made her such a dangerous influence on other women throughout their community. The most bizarre aspect of Agnes's trial was the parade of witnesses who testified that her successful bakery had indeed caused problems in their own marriages, as wives began demanding better working conditions, expressing interest in developing their own professional skills, and questioning why they couldn't achieve similar levels of domestic competence and personal satisfaction in their own household roles, creating what prosecutors characterized as an epidemic of feminine discontent, directly traceable to Agnes's subversive example. The verdict was inevitable. Agnes was convicted of all charges and sentenced to death by burning, because Brother Thomas argued that her influence on other women was so extensive and so dangerous that only complete physical destruction could prevent her ideas from continuing to spread throughout medieval society, making her execution a necessary public health measure designed to protect other wives from developing similarly rebellious attitudes about their own capabilities, ambitions, and potential for independent achievement. The domestic discipline system created an insidious class warfare among medieval women that was perhaps even more devastating than the legal persecution itself, because the Tribunal of Domestic Virtues had established dramatically different standards for noble wives versus peasant women, creating a hierarchical system of oppression that turned victims against each other instead of uniting them against their common oppressors, a divide-and-conquer strategy that Brother Thomas had deliberately designed to prevent organized feminine resistance to ecclesiastical authority. Noble women, particularly those married to wealthy landowners, influential merchants, or church officials, enjoyed what amounted to legal immunity for behaviors that would result in immediate execution for peasant wives, because their social status provided protection through what the church called aristocratic spiritual privilege, a doctrine arguing that women born into noble families possessed naturally superior moral character that made them less susceptible to the demonic influences that supposedly corrupted lower-class feminine minds. Lady Catherine de Montfort, for example, had been observed by dozens of witnesses engaging in behaviors that directly violated multiple categories of the Catalogus Criminalium Domesticorum, including public disagreement with her husband's political opinions, unauthorized management of substantial family finances, hosting social gatherings without masculine supervision, and maintaining correspondence with other noble women that discussed topics far beyond acceptable domestic concerns. Yet she faced no legal consequences because Brother Thomas ruled that her aristocratic breeding provided natural resistance to the spiritual weaknesses that made peasant women dangerous to Christian society. This double standard created explosive resentment among common women, who watched wealthy wives openly flout regulations that could cost poor women their lives, leading to a bitter internal conflict where peasant wives began informing on noble women out of frustrated rage, while aristocratic women dismissed lower-class domestic persecution as appropriate punishment for inferior people who lacked the breeding necessary to handle feminine responsibilities without threatening social stability. The church actively encouraged this class division by offering peasant women small financial rewards for reporting noble wives' violations, while simultaneously protecting aristocratic families from serious prosecution through a complex appeals process that was only available to households capable of paying substantial ecclesiastical fees, essentially creating a system where rich women could purchase immunity from domestic discipline laws that ruthlessly enforced submission among the poor. Perhaps most cruelly, noble women were encouraged to serve as domestic virtue instructors for peasant wives, a program where aristocratic ladies would visit poor households to provide advice about proper feminine behavior, creating situations where wealthy women who routinely violated matrimonial laws themselves would lecture desperate peasant wives about the importance of perfect submission, obedience, and compliance with regulations that applied only to lower classes. The psychological impact of these class divisions was devastating for all involved, because peasant women developed intense resentment toward noble wives who seemed to live with complete freedom while poor women faced execution for minor infractions, while aristocratic ladies became paranoid about maintaining their privileged status, often participating in the persecution of lower-class women to demonstrate their loyalty to a system that protected them at others' expense. Mary the seamstress became a tragic symbol of this internal conflict when she was executed for crimes identical to those committed openly by Lady Elizabeth Fitzwilliam, who had actually bragged about her violations during public gatherings, secure in her knowledge that aristocratic privilege would protect her from legal consequences that destroyed poor families throughout medieval England. The most heartbreaking aspect was how this class warfare prevented women from supporting each other during their darkest moments, as potential allies became enemies competing for limited protection within a system designed to destroy feminine solidarity, turning victims into collaborators who participated in each other's oppression rather than recognizing their shared interests in resisting ecclesiastical tyranny. Even among peasant women, the system created internal hierarchies based on their husbands' occupations, with wives of skilled craftsmen enjoying slightly better treatment than agricultural laborers' spouses, while merchant wives occupied a middle ground that provided some protection but left them vulnerable to sudden status changes that could transform privilege into persecution overnight depending on economic circumstances, political changes, or ecclesiastical whims. The Church's genius lay in ensuring that women spent their energy fighting each other rather than challenging the fundamental injustice of a system that treated feminine existence as inherently criminal, creating a self-sustaining machinery of oppression where victims policed themselves, enforced their own subjugation, and competed for survival within a framework that guaranteed most of them would eventually face prosecution regardless of their behavior, compliance, or desperate attempts to curry favor with authorities who viewed all women as potential threats requiring constant surveillance, control, and periodic elimination to maintain proper Christian social order throughout medieval European society. Faced with mounting social chaos, economic disruption, and growing evidence that their domestic discipline system was creating more problems than it solved, the Church leadership decided that what medieval society desperately needed was not legal reform, but rather more comprehensive education about proper feminine behavior, leading to the creation of the most absurd document in ecclesiastical history, the Manuale Perfecti Uxoris, or Manual of the Perfect Wife, a 200-page instructional guide that made the original Catalogus Criminalium Domesticorum look reasonable by comparison, because it attempted to provide specific, step-by-step instructions for every moment of a medieval woman's daily existence from sunrise to sunset, including detailed diagrams, practice exercises, and assessment rubrics for measuring compliance with standards so impossibly precise that following them required superhuman dedication, perfect memory, and complete abandonment of basic human dignity. Brother Thomas, convinced that domestic rebellion stemmed from insufficient feminine education rather than oppressive legal structures, assembled a team of ecclesiastical scholars, experienced domestic surveillance officers, and reformed wives who had survived prosecution to create what he considered the definitive guide to achieving matrimonial perfection through systematic elimination of every trace of independent thought, personal preference, and individual personality that might interfere with absolute masculine authority within Christian households. The manual's opening section, titled Awakening with Proper Feminine Consciousness, provided minute-by-minute instructions for the first hour of each day, beginning with prescribed prayers thanking God for another opportunity to serve masculine authority, followed by detailed procedures for rising from bed without disturbing husband's sleep, guidelines for morning hygiene that prioritized speed over thoroughness to minimize time spent on personal care, and specific techniques for beginning household tasks with appropriate facial expressions that conveyed grateful submission rather than dutiful obligation or, heaven forbid, personal satisfaction from productive work. The section on appropriate domestic communication was particularly surreal, featuring phonetic guides for maintaining proper whisper volumes, scripts for common household conversations that ensured wives never accidentally expressed independent opinions, and elaborate protocols for requesting permission to speak that included specific hand gestures, waiting periods, and formulaic phrases designed to demonstrate complete intellectual dependence on masculine guidance for even the most trivial domestic decisions. Perhaps most bizarrely, the manual included a chapter called Perfecting Invisible Existence, which taught women techniques for performing household duties so efficiently and unobtrusively that their husbands would barely notice their presence, creating an ideal domestic environment where masculine comfort appeared to maintain itself through supernatural forces rather than feminine labor, because acknowledging wives' contributions to household management might encourage dangerous feelings of pride, accomplishment, or self-worth that could evolve into rebellious attitudes threatening matrimonial stability. The manual's dietary section prescribed not only what foods wives should prepare for their husbands, but also what they themselves were permitted to eat, with detailed nutritional guidelines designed to maintain feminine health at levels sufficient for domestic productivity while preventing the excessive physical strength, mental clarity, or emotional energy that might enable resistance to masculine authority. essentially treating women's bodies as mechanical devices requiring careful calibration to maintain optimal performance without developing dangerous capabilities. The Church distributed thousands of copies throughout medieval Europe, requiring parish priests to conduct weekly perfect wife training sessions, where women would practice manual techniques under clerical supervision, submit to practical examinations testing their compliance with specific behavioral standards, and compete in domestic skill competitions that measured their progress toward achieving the impossible standards that the manual presented as basic requirements for acceptable feminine existence within Christian marriage. The psychological impact of these training sessions was devastating, as women who had previously found joy, satisfaction, or personal identity in their domestic roles discovered that the manual classified virtually every positive emotion as potentially dangerous to proper feminine submission, requiring them to suppress not only rebellious thoughts but also happiness, curiosity, creativity, and personal satisfaction that might interfere with their primary function as invisible servants dedicated exclusively to masculine comfort and convenience. Most tragically, many women internalized the manual's teachings so completely that they began policing themselves with obsessive precision, measuring their own compliance against impossible standards, confessing minor violations to priests who recorded their admissions as evidence of ongoing spiritual inadequacy, and competing with other wives to demonstrate superior dedication to the systematic elimination of their own personalities, creating a form of psychological self-destruction that was far more effective than external persecution in achieving the Church's ultimate goal of transforming independent human beings into perfectly obedient domestic appliances disguised as Christian wives. The case that finally convinced even medieval people that the domestic discipline system had descended into complete insanity was the prosecution of Isabella de Norwich in 1323, a young woman whose execution for excessive facial cheerfulness in public environments became so notorious, so internationally discussed, and so universally recognized as judicial madness that it sparked the first organized protests against ecclesiastical domestic authority in medieval European history because Isabella's crime was literally nothing more than smiling too frequently, too widely, and with too much apparent genuine happiness while conducting routine business in her village marketplace, a behavior that Brother Thomas classified as spiritual rebellion through inappropriate emotional displays that threatened public order by creating unrealistic expectations for feminine contentment within the constraints of Christian marriage. Isabella's husband, Edmund, had initially filed no complaints about his wife's cheerful disposition, but mounting social pressure from neighbors who claimed that Isabella's obvious happiness made their own wives feel inadequate forced him to report her abnormal emotional state to ecclesiastical authorities, who immediately launched an investigation to determine whether Isabella's persistent good mood represented a form of demonic possession, heretical rejection of appropriate feminine suffering, or dangerous psychological independence that required immediate correction through legal intervention. The formal charges were breathtakingly specific. Isabella was accused of displaying facial expressions indicating personal satisfaction beyond acceptable levels, smiling at inappropriate persons including unmarried men, elderly women, and small children without specific domestic purpose, laughing audibly during commercial transactions that should be conducted with proper Christian solemnity, maintaining cheerful demeanor during religious services when appropriate feminine response required somber reflection on personal sins, encouraging other women to develop unrealistic expectations about matrimonial happiness through demonstration of excessive contentment, and most incredibly, failing to display adequate levels of spiritual suffering required for proper feminine Christian development, a charge that essentially criminalized happiness as incompatible with female religious obligations. The investigation team, led by Brother Marcus, spent weeks documenting Isabella's daily emotional expressions, measuring the duration of her smiles, analyzing the frequency of her laughter, interviewing witnesses about her overall demeanor, and consulting with theological experts about whether persistent feminine cheerfulness violated biblical teachings regarding appropriate gender roles within Christian society, creating a bureaucratic nightmare where government officials were literally paid to count how many times a young woman smiled during normal daily activities. The trial featured testimony from village residents who claimed that Isabella's cheerful interactions had indeed caused problems in their own households, as wives began questioning why they couldn't achieve similar levels of personal satisfaction. Husbands felt inadequate about their ability to provide happiness comparable to what Isabella apparently experienced, and unmarried women developed unrealistic expectations about matrimonial bliss that made them more difficult to arrange in appropriate marriages with older, wealthy men who could provide economic security in exchange for resigned acceptance of domestic servitude. Brother Thomas argued that Isabella's persistent happiness was particularly dangerous because it appeared completely natural and unforced, making it an exceptionally effective form of subversive propaganda that could inspire other women to prioritize personal contentment over proper feminine submission, creating a social epidemic of wives demanding better treatment, more personal freedom, and actual partnership within marriages that were supposed to function as systems of masculine authority, supported by feminine self-sacrifice and grateful acceptance of whatever conditions their husbands chose to provide. The defense attempted to argue that Isabella's cheerful nature was simply a personality trait that had no political implications, but Brother Thomas countered that feminine personality itself was a form of rebellion against divine order, because women were supposed to derive their emotional states entirely from their husband's approval rather than maintaining independent sources of happiness, satisfaction, or personal contentment that might reduce their dependence on masculine validation and authority within domestic relationships. The most surreal aspect of Isabella's trial was the theological debate about whether God intended women to be happy, with ecclesiastical scholars presenting complex arguments about the spiritual significance of feminine emotional states, the appropriate role of joy in Christian women's lives, and the dangerous implications of allowing wives to experience personal satisfaction that didn't derive directly from their success in serving masculine needs and maintaining household efficiency according to church-approved domestic management standards. Isabella herself, when permitted to speak during the proceedings, made the fatal mistake of explaining that she smiled frequently because she enjoyed interacting with people, found pleasure in daily activities, and felt grateful for the life she had built with her husband, a statement that Brother Thomas interpreted as confession to the crime of spiritual independence from appropriate masculine emotional control, proving that her cheerful demeanor represented a sophisticated form of domestic rebellion disguised as innocent feminine virtue, making her execution necessary to prevent other women from developing similarly dangerous attitudes about their right to personal happiness, emotional autonomy, and psychological independence within Christian marriage relationships. The domestic discipline system established by Brother Thomas and his Tribunal of Domestic Virtues didn't simply vanish when medieval society finally recognized its insanity, because the legal precedents, bureaucratic procedures, and philosophical foundations created during this period became deeply embedded in European law, directly influencing the development of matrimonial legislation that would oppress women for the next 6 centuries, most notably contributing to the infamous rule of thumb doctrine that legally permitted husbands to beat their wives with sticks no thicker than a man's thumb, a law that remained officially recognized in English courts until 1891, proving that medieval misogyny had remarkable staying power within legal systems that valued precedent over basic human dignity. The connection between 14th-century domestic prosecution and later matrimonial law becomes crystal clear when examining the 1736 English legal case of Bradley versus Bradley, where Judge Sir William Blackstone explicitly cited Brother Thomas's Catalogus Criminalium Domesticorum as legal precedent for his ruling that wives had no right to refuse sexual relations, control household finances, or maintain social relationships without their husband's explicit permission, demonstrating how medieval ecclesiastical tyranny evolved into secular legal oppression that maintained the same fundamental principle that women's existence required constant masculine supervision and control. Even more disturbing is the direct line connecting medieval domestic discipline to the witch trials that terrorized European women between 1450 and 1750, because the investigative techniques developed by Brother Marcus for detecting spiritual rebellion through inappropriate emotional displays became standard procedures used by witch hunters to identify supernatural influence in women who exhibited independence, intelligence, or resistance to masculine authority, with the Malleus Maleficarum explicitly referencing the tribunal's methods for analyzing feminine behavior patterns as evidence of demonic possession requiring execution by fire. The economic incentive structures pioneered by the domestic discipline system also survived intact, evolving into the legal framework that allowed husbands to claim ownership of their wives' property, wages, and even children until the late 19th century, because medieval precedents establishing feminine legal incompetence provided convenient justification for treating married women as property rather than human beings capable of independent decision-making, economic activity, or legal representation in matters affecting their own lives and interests. Perhaps most tragically, the psychological techniques developed for breaking women's spirits during the perfect wife training sessions became foundational elements of what Victorian society celebrated as proper feminine education, with 19th-century finishing schools using methods virtually identical to Brother Thomas's behavioral modification programs to train upper-class women to suppress their personalities, eliminate independent thoughts and transform themselves into decorative objects designed exclusively for masculine pleasure and social advancement, proving that systematic oppression could survive for centuries simply by rebranding itself as educational improvement rather than legal persecution. The influence extended beyond marriage law into broader legal principles that treated women's testimony as inherently unreliable, their emotional expressions as evidence of mental instability, and their intellectual capabilities as fundamentally inferior to masculine reasoning abilities, creating a comprehensive legal framework that made it virtually impossible for women to seek protection from domestic violence, pursue independent careers, control their own finances, or participate in political processes that affected their daily lives and fundamental rights as human beings. The most shocking connection involves the development of psychiatric medicine, because the diagnostic criteria used to classify women as mentally ill throughout the 18th and 19th centuries were derived directly from Brother Thomas's theories about appropriate feminine psychology, with doctors routinely diagnosing women with hysteria for exhibiting behaviors that medieval authorities had classified as domestic rebellion, including curiosity about subjects beyond household management, resistance to masculine authority, emotional expressions exceeding prescribed intensity levels, and desires for personal autonomy that medical professionals considered symptoms of psychological disorder requiring institutional confinement and aggressive treatment. The legal concept of coverture, which legally erased married women's independent existence by declaring them property of their husbands, drew explicit justification from medieval precedents established during the domestic discipline era, with legal scholars arguing that centuries of successful feminine regulation through ecclesiastical oversight proved that women required permanent masculine guardianship to prevent the social chaos that resulted from allowing female independence, creating a circular logic where past oppression justified continued oppression as necessary for maintaining social stability and Christian values. The domestic discipline system's most lasting legacy was its successful transformation of systematic misogyny into legal precedent that appeared reasonable, necessary, and divinely sanctioned rather than arbitrary cruelty designed to maintain masculine power through feminine subjugation. A rhetorical achievement so effective that it convinced millions of people across multiple centuries that treating women as dangerous children requiring constant supervision was not only appropriate but essential for protecting civilization from the chaos that supposedly resulted from feminine autonomy, independence, and basic human dignity, making Brother Thomas's medieval legal framework one of the most successful and enduring systems of oppression in human history, with consequences that extended far beyond the original victims to shape legal systems, social structures, and cultural attitudes that continued denying women fundamental rights until well into the 20th century, and in some cases, persist even today in modified forms that maintain the same underlying assumption that feminine existence poses an inherent threat to social order requiring systematic control and regulation by masculine authority. The absolute pinnacle of medieval domestic discipline madness occurred during what historians call the Great Judgment of 1323, when Brother Thomas orchestrated the simultaneous prosecution of 12 women from different villages across England, creating a spectacular legal circus that was designed to demonstrate the system's efficiency, serve as a warning to potential female rebels, and generate enough revenue to fund the construction of a massive new cathedral dedicated to saint submission. But instead became such an obvious travesty of justice that it shocked even medieval sensibilities and sparked the first organized resistance movement against ecclesiastical domestic authority in European history. The 12 defendants had been carefully selected to represent different types of feminine criminality, creating what Brother Thomas called a comprehensive demonstration of domestic rebellion, that would educate the public about the full spectrum of threats posed by uncontrolled women to Christian society, but the cases were so absurdly trivial, so obviously manufactured, and so transparently motivated by greed rather than justice that the proceedings collapsed into farce before the first day of testimony had concluded. Margaret of York was accused of excessive competence in herb gardening after her medicinal plants proved more effective than those cultivated by local monks, suggesting that her superior knowledge represented either supernatural assistance or dangerous feminine intellectual development that threatened masculine authority in medical matters, while Joan of Canterbury faced charges for inappropriate maternal affection, because she had been observed kissing her children more frequently than church guidelines recommended, creating what prosecutors claimed was emotional instability that could corrupt proper Christian child-rearing practices throughout medieval society. Perhaps most bizarrely, Anna the Weaver was prosecuted for textile excellence exceeding feminine capabilities, because her embroidery work was so superior to other women's efforts that customers specifically requested her services, creating what Brother Thomas classified as unfair commercial advantage gained through spiritual rebellion against divine limitations placed on feminine skill development, while Catherine of London faced execution for reading without proper masculine supervision. After being caught studying religious texts independently rather than waiting for her husband to provide appropriate interpretation and guidance regarding spiritual matters, the charges became progressively more insane as the proceedings continued. Elizabeth the Candlemaker was accused of creating illumination that competed with divine light, because her candles burned brighter and lasted longer than standard products. Mary the Musician faced prosecution for producing sounds that inspired inappropriate feminine emotions, after other women were observed enjoying her performances. Anne Sarah of Bristol was charged with demonstrating mathematical abilities that exceeded biblical feminine limitations, because she had calculated household budgets with accuracy that embarrassed local male accountants who regularly made errors in their professional work. The trial procedures were equally surreal, featuring a panel of 47 male judges who spent days debating theological implications of feminine flour grinding techniques, ecclesiastical significance of vegetable gardening patterns, and spiritual dangers posed by women who could perform domestic tasks with efficiency that made masculine household contributions appear unnecessary, creating legal arguments so convoluted and ridiculous that court scribes began including marginal notes, expressing their own disbelief at the proceedings they were required to document for posterity. Brother Thomas had intended the mass prosecution to demonstrate his system's sophistication and effectiveness, but instead revealed its fundamental absurdity when several judges began openly questioning whether the church had lost its collective sanity, while spectators started laughing during testimony about the spiritual dangers of well-baked bread and the demonic implications of neatly folded laundry, transforming what was supposed to be a solemn demonstration of ecclesiastical justice into an unintended comedy that undermined the entire domestic discipline program. The defendants themselves, initially terrified by the prospect of facing execution for their trivial crimes, gradually realized that the proceedings were so obviously ridiculous that even medieval audiences couldn't take them seriously, leading several women to begin openly mocking their accusers, pointing out logical inconsistencies in the charges against them, and delivering eloquent speeches about the fundamental injustice of a legal system that treated feminine competence as criminal behavior requiring capital punishment to protect masculine fragility from embarrassment. The turning point came when Rebecca the Healer, accused of medical knowledge exceeding appropriate feminine understanding, challenged Brother Thomas to explain how helping sick people could possibly represent rebellion against God's will, a question that he answered by claiming that feminine healing abilities competed with divine authority over life and death, prompting such sustained laughter from the audience that the proceedings had to be temporarily suspended while guards restored order to the courtroom. The Great Judgment ultimately collapsed when several of the male judges walked out in disgust, refusing to participate further in what they publicly denounced as a mockery of legitimate legal proceedings, while crowds of supporters gathered outside the courthouse chanting demands for the defendants' release, creating the first popular uprising against ecclesiastical domestic authority in medieval history and forcing Brother Thomas to abandon his showcase trial in humiliating defeat that marked the beginning of the end for his domestic discipline system, proving that even societies accustomed to systematic oppression had limits regarding the levels of absurdity they would tolerate from their legal institutions. The collapse of the Great Judgment triggered an unprecedented popular uprising that began with the merchant women of London and quickly spread throughout medieval England, because the spectacle of 12 women facing execution for crimes as ridiculous as superior bread baking and excessive garden competence had finally pushed public tolerance past its breaking point, creating a massive social movement that combined outraged mothers, disgusted fathers, embarrassed husbands, and even sympathetic church officials who could no longer stomach the systematic persecution of women for the crime of being competent human beings. The rebellion started when Margaret Kemp, a successful wool merchant whose own wife had narrowly escaped prosecution for commercial success exceeding feminine limitations, organized what she called the March of Reasonable People through London streets, attracting thousands of participants who carried signs reading "Sanity for Our Sisters," "End Ecclesiastical Madness," and most provocatively, "Brother Thomas has lost his mind," demonstrations that marked the first time in medieval history that ordinary citizens had publicly challenged church authority over domestic policy through organized political action. The speed with which the resistance movement grew was absolutely remarkable, because within weeks of the Great Judgment's collapse, similar protests were occurring in every major English city, with merchants closing their shops, farmers abandoning their fields, and craftsmen suspending their work to participate in rallies demanding immediate dissolution of the Tribunal of Domestic Virtues and public trials for the church officials who had participated in what protesters increasingly characterized as legalized murder disguised as religious enforcement. Perhaps most significantly, the uprising included substantial numbers of men who had initially supported domestic discipline laws but now recognized that the system had become so extreme, so obviously corrupt, and so destructive to community life that it threatened social stability far more than the supposed feminine rebellion it claimed to prevent, creating an unusual coalition of husbands, fathers, and brothers united in their determination to protect the women in their families from continued ecclesiastical persecution. The Church's response to popular resistance was characteristically tone-deaf and counterproductive, with high-ranking officials issuing proclamations declaring that public criticism of domestic discipline policies constituted heresy punishable by excommunication, fines, and potential imprisonment, threats that only intensified popular anger and convinced previously neutral citizens that ecclesiastical authorities had indeed lost touch with basic Christian principles of mercy, justice, and proportionality in their obsessive campaign to control feminine behavior. Brother Thomas himself became a figure of ridicule rather than fear, with satirical songs, comedic plays, and mocking poems circulating throughout English communities, portraying him as a deranged fanatic whose hatred of women had consumed his sanity, destroyed his credibility, and transformed him into a laughingstock whose continued presence in ecclesiastical leadership embarrassed the entire Catholic Church, making his removal from power a matter of institutional survival rather than popular demand. The most powerful element of the resistance movement was the testimony of surviving victims, women who had endured prosecution, imprisonment, and torture for trivial domestic violations, speaking publicly about their experiences in ways that revealed the human cost of systematic oppression, generating emotional responses from audiences who finally understood that the domestic discipline system wasn't protecting Christian values but rather satisfying the sadistic impulses of men who enjoyed exercising absolute power over vulnerable people. Eleanor's widowed sister, Mary, became particularly influential by describing her sister's final days in graphic detail, explaining how a woman who had committed no real crime suffered through weeks of terror, humiliation, and physical abuse before dying for the unforgivable sin of making household decisions without masculine permission, testimony that reduced hardened medieval audiences to tears and convinced many previous supporters that the system represented evil masquerading as religious devotion. The economic impact of popular resistance was devastating for church finances, because merchant boycotts, reduced tithes, and withdrawal of voluntary donations created budget crises that forced ecclesiastical officials to choose between maintaining expensive domestic surveillance programs and funding essential religious services that actually served community spiritual needs, making the domestic discipline system financially unsustainable regardless of its theological justifications or legal precedents. Local priests found themselves caught between ecclesiastical superiors demanding continued enforcement of matrimonial regulations and parishioners threatening to abandon their churches if persecution of local women continued, creating impossible situations where clergy had to choose between career advancement and community relationships, with many ultimately deciding that their pastoral responsibilities to actual human beings outweighed their obligations to abstract theological theories about feminine criminality. The resistance movement's ultimate success came through sustained economic pressure, social ostracism of officials who participated in domestic prosecutions, and relentless public ridicule that made continued enforcement politically impossible, proving that even authoritarian systems could be defeated when enough ordinary people decided that institutional madness had progressed beyond acceptable limits and organized effective opposition that combined moral outrage, economic leverage, and social pressure to force fundamental change in policies that violated basic human decency, creating precedents for popular resistance that would inspire future generations of activists fighting against systematic oppression disguised as legitimate authority. The most bizarre legacy of Brother Thomas's domestic discipline system wasn't its eventual collapse, but rather the absolutely surreal collection of legal documents, theological treatises, and bureaucratic records that survived the purge of ecclesiastical archives, creating a treasure trove of medieval madness that modern historians study with fascination, horror, and frequent bursts of incredulous laughter at the sheer absurdity of a society that devoted enormous intellectual resources to systematizing the oppression of women for imaginary crimes that existed only in the twisted minds of religious fanatics obsessed with controlling every aspect of feminine existence. The Vatican Library still contains Brother Thomas's personal notebooks, where he meticulously documented his theories about the spiritual dangers posed by women who smiled too frequently, walked too confidently, or demonstrated competence levels that exceeded what he considered appropriate for feminine minds. Writings that read like the work of someone who had never actually interacted with real women but had instead developed elaborate fantasies about female psychology based entirely on abstract theological speculation and pathological misogyny. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval monasteries preserved detailed financial records showing that domestic discipline prosecutions generated more revenue than traditional church activities like baptisms, weddings, and funeral services combined, proving that the systematic persecution of women had become one of the Catholic Church's most profitable enterprises, with some ecclesiastical regions deriving over 60% of their annual income from matrimonial violation fines, property confiscations, and fees charged for domestic surveillance services that essentially turned marriage into a subscription-based oppression program. The Catalogus Criminalium Domesticorum survived in multiple copies throughout European libraries, where it continued influencing legal thought for centuries after its original publication, with Renaissance lawyers citing Brother Thomas's classification system as precedent for marriage laws, Enlightenment philosophers referencing his theories about feminine psychology in their discussions of gender roles, and even Victorian reformers inadvertently perpetuating his ideas about appropriate female behavior while claiming to advocate for women's rights and social advancement. The most disturbing aspect of this intellectual legacy was how Brother Thomas's clearly insane theories about female criminality became incorporated into mainstream legal thought, medical practice, and educational philosophy, creating a situation where generations of supposedly rational thinkers accepted as scientific fact the notion that women who displayed independence, intelligence, or emotional autonomy were suffering from psychological disorders requiring treatment, control, or elimination to protect social stability and masculine authority. The domestic discipline system also established bureaucratic precedents that influenced the development of modern surveillance states, because Brother Thomas's methods for monitoring private behavior, documenting personal relationships, and converting ordinary citizens into informants provided templates for political oppression that authoritarian governments would employ for centuries, proving that the techniques developed for controlling medieval wives were easily adaptable to broader programs of social control and population management. Medieval universities began teaching courses based on Brother Thomas's writings, creating entire academic departments devoted to studying what they called domestic criminology, with scholars earning advanced degrees by analyzing case studies of women executed for trivial violations, developing new theories about feminine psychology, and proposing improvements to existing systems for detecting and punishing domestic rebellion, essentially turning the persecution of women into a respected intellectual discipline that attracted serious academic attention from supposedly educated individuals. The influence extended into literature and popular culture, with medieval storytellers incorporating domestic discipline themes into their narratives, creating folk tales about rebellious wives who faced supernatural punishment for disobeying their husbands, songs celebrating the wisdom of masculine authority in controlling feminine excess, and morality plays that taught audiences about the spiritual dangers posed by women who exceeded their prescribed social roles, embedding Brother Thomas's misogynistic ideology deep within European cultural consciousness. Perhaps most bizarrely, some medieval communities developed annual festivals commemorating the restoration of domestic order, that celebrated the end of female rebellion through pageants where local women would perform elaborate demonstrations of proper submissive behavior, compete in contests measuring their compliance with behavioral regulations, and publicly renew their commitments to masculine authority, creating grotesque spectacles that transformed systematic oppression into community entertainment that persisted for decades after the original prosecutions had ended. The legal precedents established during the domestic discipline era proved remarkably durable, surviving multiple political changes, religious reforms, and social revolutions that eliminated many other medieval institutions, because the fundamental assumption that women required constant masculine supervision was so deeply embedded in European legal thought that it appeared natural, reasonable, and necessary rather than arbitrary tyranny designed to maintain gender hierarchies through systematic intimidation and violence. Modern feminist historians studying these records often report experiencing a mixture of rage, disbelief, and dark humor when confronting the sheer banality of evil represented by Brother Thomas's systematic persecution of women, because the careful documentation, bureaucratic efficiency, and intellectual pretensions surrounding clearly insane policies demonstrate how easily societies can convince themselves that obvious cruelty represents moral progress, religious devotion, and necessary. Social reform, making the domestic discipline system a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing abstract ideologies to override basic human decency, critical thinking, and recognition of fundamental equality between human beings regardless of their gender, social status, or willingness to conform to arbitrary behavioral standards imposed by people who mistake power for wisdom and control for righteousness. Now, before you dismiss Brother Thomas's domestic discipline system as ancient history with no relevance to modern life, consider that we live in an era where people voluntarily document their daily activities on social media platforms that monitor their behavior, analyze their preferences, and use sophisticated algorithms to influence their decisions, creating a surveillance infrastructure that would make medieval ecclesiastical authorities weep with envy at its efficiency, comprehensiveness, and the eager participation of the people being monitored, proving that humans have an apparently inexhaustible capacity for accepting systematic observation of their personal lives as long as it comes with entertaining distractions and convenient services. The parallels between medieval domestic discipline and modern relationship dynamics are actually quite disturbing when you consider how many contemporary couples engage in elaborate negotiations about household responsibilities, financial decisions, and social activities that would be perfectly familiar to Brother Thomas's tribunal, except that instead of ecclesiastical courts, we have relationship counselors, marriage therapists, and self-help gurus who help people develop communication strategies and boundary-setting techniques that sometimes sound suspiciously like updated versions of medieval behavioral modification programs designed to manage interpersonal conflicts through systematic monitoring and rule enforcement. Perhaps most amusingly, the modern divorce industry has created a legal framework that makes Brother Thomas's domestic prosecution system look almost efficient by comparison, because contemporary matrimonial disputes can drag on for years, involve teams of lawyers, financial analysts, and psychological evaluators, consume enormous resources investigating trivial disagreements about household management, and ultimately leave both parties financially devastated and emotionally traumatized, proving that we've somehow managed to make ending marriages even more bureaucratically complex and psychologically damaging than medieval authorities made maintaining them. The technology industry has essentially reinvented Brother Thomas's surveillance methods using apps that track everything from sleep patterns and exercise habits to spending behaviors and social interactions, with couples voluntarily sharing their location data, communication records, and personal activities with their partners in ways that create unprecedented levels of mutual monitoring, except that instead of calling it domestic discipline, we rebrand it as relationship transparency. Digital intimacy, or collaborative lifestyle optimization, demonstrating remarkable human creativity in developing euphemisms for control mechanisms that would horrify us if implemented by authoritarian governments. Modern parenting culture has produced child-rearing philosophies that rival the Catalogus Criminalium Domesticorum in their detailed specifications for appropriate behavior, emotional expression, and developmental milestones, with parents documenting their children's activities with obsessive precision, consulting experts about every aspect of childhood development, and creating elaborate behavioral modification programs that would make Brother Marcus proud, except that contemporary parents have access to scientific research, psychological theories, and educational resources that somehow haven't prevented them from driving themselves insane trying to optimize their children's existence according to constantly changing expert recommendations. The workplace has developed its own version of domestic discipline through human resources departments that monitor employee behavior, enforce dress codes, regulate social interactions, and maintain detailed documentation about workplace violations that can result in career destruction for infractions as trivial as inappropriate email tone, excessive bathroom breaks, or unauthorized personal conversations during work hours, creating professional environments where adults spend their days walking on eggshells to avoid triggering bureaucratic responses that medieval people would recognize as essentially identical to ecclesiastical persecution disguised as organizational management. Perhaps most ironically, the internet has created vast communities of people who voluntarily submit to behavioral regulations enforced by moderators who possess arbitrary authority to ban, suspend, or publicly humiliate users for violations of community standards that are often as vague, inconsistent, and subjectively interpreted as Brother Thomas's domestic regulations, with the added twist that people actually compete for the attention and approval of these digital authorities while simultaneously complaining about their unfair treatment by systems they choose to participate in daily. The self-help industry has generated thousands of books, seminars, and online courses teaching people how to achieve optimal relationships, peak performance, and authentic living through systematic behavior modification, goal tracking, and regular self-assessment that bears striking resemblance to medieval programs for achieving spiritual perfection through elimination of personal desires, independent thoughts, and non-conforming behaviors, suggesting that humans have an apparently universal need to transform natural human complexity into manageable systems of rules, measurements, and improvement strategies. The most darkly amusing parallel involves modern social justice movements that sometimes replicate Brother Thomas's methods by creating elaborate lists of prohibited behaviors, demanding public confessions for ideological violations, and organizing community pressure campaigns against people whose personal choices allegedly threaten group solidarity, proving that the human capacity for transforming moral concerns into systematic oppression transcends historical periods, political ideologies, and technological capabilities, making Brother Thomas's domestic discipline system less an artifact of medieval backwardness than an unfortunately typical example of what happens when well-meaning people decide that social problems require comprehensive behavioral control rather than basic respect for human dignity, individual autonomy, and the messy complexity that characterizes actual human relationships in all their imperfect, unmanageable, and ultimately beautiful reality. So what profound life lessons can we extract from the absolutely bonkers tale of medieval Europe's systematic persecution of women for the crime of existing with personalities, opinions, and basic human competence? Because if we're going to spend an hour and a half learning about Brother Thomas's deranged campaign against feminine autonomy, we should probably derive some practical wisdom from this historical nightmare, even if that wisdom is primarily, don't let religious fanatics create legal systems, and maybe question authority figures who seem suspiciously interested in controlling other people's private behavior for their own supposed spiritual benefit. The most obvious lesson is that bureaucracy combined with moral certainty creates a uniquely dangerous form of institutional madness, because Brother Thomas genuinely believed he was protecting Christian civilization from feminine chaos. His assistants sincerely thought they were conducting important theological research, and thousands of ordinary citizens participated enthusiastically in systematic oppression while convincing themselves they were performing righteous community service, proving that good intentions, religious devotion, and even academic credentials provide absolutely no protection against becoming instruments of obvious evil when people stop thinking critically about the systems they support. Perhaps more importantly, the domestic discipline era demonstrates that societies can normalize literally anything if the process happens gradually enough and involves sufficient bureaucratic complexity to make the underlying cruelty seem like reasonable policy implementation, because medieval people didn't wake up one morning and decide to execute women for smiling too much, but instead participated in a slow escalation of increasingly absurd regulations that each seemed only slightly more extreme than the previous standard, creating a psychological pathway that led ordinary people to accept mass murder as appropriate response to domestic disagreements. The financial incentives driving the system reveal another timeless truth about human nature. People will convince themselves that almost any behavior is morally justified if it generates sufficient profit, social advancement, or personal security, because the same neighbors who had previously enjoyed Eleanor's company became eager witnesses against her when testifying offered economic rewards and social protection, while church officials who might have questioned the system privately continued participating publicly because their careers, reputations, and comfortable lifestyles depended on maintaining ecclesiastical approval and institutional support. The most darkly amusing lesson involves the spectacular failure of Brother Thomas's attempt to solve social problems through comprehensive behavioral control, because his system created exponentially more chaos, violence, and community disruption than the original problems it was designed to address, proving that authoritarian solutions typically generate exactly the disorders they claim to prevent while creating entirely new categories of suffering that are far worse than whatever issues motivated the initial intervention. The speed with which popular opinion shifted from support to revulsion once the system's absurdity became undeniable offers some hope for modern audiences confronting their own institutional madness, because it demonstrates that even deeply entrenched systems of oppression can collapse rapidly when enough people simultaneously recognize that they're participating in something fundamentally ridiculous, cruel, and contrary to basic human decency that they had somehow been trained to accept as normal, reasonable, or necessary for social stability. Brother Thomas himself provides a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual arrogance combined with unlimited authority, because his genuine scholarly abilities, theological training, and bureaucratic competence made him more dangerous than simple thugs or obvious madmen, since his systematic approach to oppression appeared rational, scientific, and morally sophisticated to people who didn't look too closely at the human consequences of his elaborate theoretical frameworks and administrative procedures. The domestic discipline system's legacy also teaches us to be deeply suspicious of any ideology that claims to protect vulnerable people by systematically controlling their behavior, restricting their autonomy, or eliminating their ability to make independent choices, because such programs typically serve the interests of the people implementing control rather than those supposedly being helped, as evidenced by the fact that Brother Thomas and his associates became wealthy and powerful while their alleged beneficiaries ended up dead, impoverished, or psychologically destroyed. Perhaps the most practical lesson for modern audiences is that resistance to systematic oppression doesn't require heroic gestures or revolutionary violence, because the domestic discipline system ultimately collapsed due to ordinary people making everyday decisions to stop cooperating with obvious madness, whether through economic boycotts, social ostracism, public ridicule, or simple refusal to participate in community persecution of their neighbors, friends, and family members who had committed no real crimes beyond failing to conform to arbitrary behavioral standards. The final moral of this medieval nightmare is simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Human societies are capable of both remarkable cruelty and surprising resilience, because the same species that created Brother Thomas's domestic discipline system also produced the popular resistance movement that destroyed it, proving that while people can be trained to accept almost any form of systematic oppression, they also retain the capacity to recognize institutional madness, organize effective opposition, and create positive change when they decide that enough is enough and begin acting on their conviction that basic human dignity matters more than abstract ideological purity, bureaucratic efficiency, or the comfortable maintenance of systems that sacrifice individual people to preserve institutional power, authority, and the illusion of social order. Now, if you think Brother Thomas's persecution of women for domestic competence represents the absolute peak of medieval legal insanity, prepare yourself for next week's story, because I'm going to tell you about the equally bizarre flip side of ecclesiastical marriage regulation: the systematic prosecution of medieval husbands who were deemed excessively merciful toward their wives, creating a parallel legal nightmare where men faced imprisonment, financial ruin, and social ostracism for the apparently criminal behavior of treating their spouses with kindness, respect, and basic human decency that church authorities classified as dangerous masculine weakness, that threatened the divine gender hierarchy by failing to maintain appropriate levels of feminine submission through regular physical discipline, verbal intimidation, and economic control. The case that will serve as our entry point into this inverted world of matrimonial madness involves Sir Geoffrey de Ashford, a wealthy landowner who was formally charged in 1324 with criminal conjugal gentleness, after neighbors reported that he had never been observed striking his wife, frequently asked for her opinions on household matters, and most shockingly, was seen helping her carry heavy objects and assisting with domestic tasks that ecclesiastical law classified as exclusively feminine responsibilities that real men should never perform under any circumstances. The church had developed elaborate theories about what they called masculine spiritual corruption, arguing that men who failed to exercise proper dominance over their wives were actually committing heresy against God's natural order, because divine scripture allegedly required husbands to maintain female obedience through whatever means necessary, making kindness toward women a form of blasphemy that corrupted both the gentle husband's soul and the insufficiently oppressed wife's spiritual development through lack of appropriate suffering and submission. Brother Thomas, apparently unsatisfied with persecuting women exclusively, had expanded his domestic discipline system to include what he called deficient masculine authority syndrome, a condition diagnosed in men who displayed dangerous symptoms like consulting their wives before making decisions, sharing household financial information, allowing their spouses to maintain friendships with other women, and worst of all, expressing affection or emotional attachment that exceeded the cold, business-like relationship that the church considered appropriate for properly Christian marriages between spiritually superior men and inherently inferior women. The investigation techniques developed for prosecuting gentle husbands were remarkably sophisticated, involving neighborhood surveillance networks that monitored couples' private interactions, documented instances of masculine kindness, measured the frequency of physical discipline administered to wives, and maintained detailed records of household power dynamics to ensure that men were fulfilling their religious obligations to maintain female subjugation through systematic cruelty disguised as spiritual guidance and moral leadership. Sir Geoffrey's case became particularly notorious because his wife, Lady Catherine, testified that her husband had never raised his hand against her in 12 years of marriage, regularly sought her advice about estate management, encouraged her intellectual pursuits including reading and correspondence with other noble women, and had even been observed performing household tasks like serving her meals and assisting with childcare when she was ill, behaviors that prosecutors characterized as evidence of complete masculine spiritual collapse requiring immediate intervention to prevent the corruption of other marriages throughout medieval England. The penalties for criminal conjugal gentleness were specifically designed to restore proper gender hierarchies through public humiliation rituals where guilty husbands were forced to demonstrate appropriate wife-beating techniques under ecclesiastical supervision, pay substantial fines to fund domestic discipline enforcement programs, and undergo mandatory masculine authority restoration therapy, conducted by priests who specialized in teaching men how to properly intimidate, control, and systematically abuse their wives according to church-approved methods that would maintain feminine submission while satisfying divine requirements for conjugal relationships. The most bizarre aspect of these prosecutions was how they revealed the church's fundamental belief that marriage couldn't function without constant masculine cruelty, because ecclesiastical theorists argued that women were naturally rebellious, intellectually dangerous, and spiritually corruptive unless kept in perpetual fear through regular physical punishment, emotional abuse, and systematic degradation that prevented them from developing the confidence, independence, or personal relationships that might threaten masculine authority within Christian households and broader medieval society. The system created absurd situations where men competed to demonstrate their compliance with cruelty requirements by publicly bragging about their wife-beating techniques, comparing notes about effective intimidation strategies, and seeking ecclesiastical approval for increasingly creative methods of maintaining feminine terror, essentially turning domestic violence into a religious performance that men felt obligated to conduct not from personal sadism but from genuine fear that failing to abuse their wives would result in legal prosecution, social ostracism, and accusations of heretical rejection of divine gender hierarchies. Next week, I'll take you through the documented cases of dozens of medieval husbands who faced criminal charges for treating their wives like human beings, the elaborate legal arguments used to justify prosecuting kindness as heresy, and the absolutely insane bureaucratic machinery that transformed marital gentleness into a capital offense, revealing how the same twisted logic that executed women for competence also destroyed men for compassion, creating a comprehensive system of domestic horror that made loving relationships literally illegal under medieval ecclesiastical law, proving that Brother Thomas's hatred of human happiness extended far beyond his obvious misogyny to encompass a general contempt for basic human decency in all its forms. As the dawn breaks on our journey through medieval Europe's most absurd legal nightmare, and the shadows of Brother Thomas's domestic discipline system finally retreat into the historical darkness where they belong, I hope you're feeling a mixture of horror, fascination, and dark amusement at the sheer human capacity for transforming basic relationships into bureaucratic nightmares, because tonight's story of women executed for speaking without permission reveals both the worst and best of human nature, showing how ordinary people can become instruments of systematic oppression while also demonstrating that communities eventually recognize institutional madness and organize effective resistance against obviously evil systems disguised as moral progress. The documented cases we've explored tonight, from Marguerite's execution for refusing to serve cold dinner to Isabella's death for excessive cheerfulness, represent just a tiny fraction of the thousands of women who died during the domestic discipline era, their individual stories preserved in ecclesiastical records that read like dark satire written by someone who despised both humanity and common sense, creating a historical archive that serves as permanent testimony to the dangers of allowing religious fanaticism, bureaucratic complexity, and economic incentives to override basic recognition of human dignity and fundamental equality. If tonight's medieval horror story has left you wondering about the connections between historical oppression and modern systems of control, take a moment to consider how many contemporary institutions claim to protect vulnerable people through systematic regulation of their behavior, elimination of their autonomy, and punishment of their nonconformity, because the psychological mechanisms that convinced medieval communities to participate in Brother Thomas's domestic persecution remain fully operational in societies that pride themselves on being enlightened, progressive, and committed to human rights and social justice. Before you drift into sleep tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell, because next week's story about medieval husbands prosecuted for treating their wives with kindness will complete our exploration of ecclesiastical marriage regulation and reveal how the same twisted logic that criminalized feminine competence also made masculine compassion a capital offense, creating a comprehensive system of domestic horror that made loving relationships literally Illegal under medieval church law and proving that institutional hatred of human happiness can target anyone who threatens established power structures through the dangerous act of treating other people with basic respect and dignity. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about the parallels between medieval domestic discipline and modern relationship dynamics, because I'm genuinely curious whether you see connections between Brother Thomas's surveillance methods and contemporary social media monitoring, his behavioral modification programs and current self-improvement culture, or his systematic persecution of competent women and ongoing professional discrimination that punishes people for exceeding others' comfort levels. Through superior performance, intelligence, or independence that threatens established hierarchies and social expectations. The most important message from tonight's story isn't that medieval people were uniquely cruel or backwards, because humans in every historical period have demonstrated remarkable creativity in developing systems of oppression that appear reasonable, necessary, and morally justified to participants who benefit from maintaining existing power structures while imposing suffering on vulnerable populations who lack sufficient political influence to protect themselves from institutional violence. Disguised as legitimate authority, law enforcement, or social improvement. What makes Brother Thomas's domestic discipline system particularly relevant for modern audiences is how clearly it demonstrates that systematic oppression always presents itself as rational policy designed to solve important social problems, protect valuable cultural traditions, and maintain necessary order against dangerous forces that threaten community stability, making it essential for thoughtful people to regularly examine their own participation in systems that might be causing harm. While claiming to promote safety, morality, or social progress through regulation, monitoring, and punishment of people whose behavior, appearance, or choices don't conform to prescribed standards established by authorities who profit from maintaining control over others' lives and decisions. The medieval women who died for speaking without permission, demonstrating excessive competence, or simply appearing too happy serve as permanent reminders that individual human dignity matters more than abstract ideological consistency, bureaucratic efficiency, or institutional authority, because systems that treat people as problems requiring solutions rather than individuals deserving respect inevitably evolve into machinery of oppression that destroys exactly the values they claim to protect while generating profits, power, and psychological satisfaction for people who mistake control over others for moral achievement or spiritual advancement. So as you close your eyes tonight and let your mind process the bizarre tale of Marguerite, Eleanor, Agnes, and Isabella, remember that their stories survive not just as historical curiosities but as warnings about the eternal human capacity for transforming good intentions into systematic evil, creating comprehensive legal frameworks for persecuting innocents, and convincing entire communities to participate enthusiastically in obviously insane programs that sacrifice individual people to maintain abstract principles, social hierarchies, and institutional power structures that benefit few while harming many, making vigilance against such systems a permanent responsibility for anyone who believes that basic human decency should prevail over organizational efficiency, ideological purity, or the comfortable maintenance of familiar injustices that seem normal only because they've existed long enough to appear natural.